welcome to our next session, Not Quite, Not White. Please welcome to the stage Margo Jefferson, Sharmila Sen, and Philip Lutgendorf in conversation.
Thank you. I'm Philip Lutgendorf, and I'm a white male academic who translates medieval Hindi poetry, which shows that I'm incredibly qualified to moderate this session with these two extraordinary authors. Not. But what I am is honored, deeply honored to be with them and to have just read their books. I am, of course, to my right is Margo Jefferson, Pulitzer Prize winner, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for the book we're going to be talking about, Negroland, but she's also the author of On Michael Jackson, which will be discussed immediately after this session up in Skyscapes upstairs. She'll be talking about that. Dr. Sharmila Sen, who has a PhD in English literature from Yale and taught at Harvard English literature and is now senior editor at large. Does that mean that you sort of run around? Or? Yeah. Okay. She's senior editor at large at Harvard University Press, and I should say on a personal note that I've had the privilege of working with her for the last 8 years on a multi-volume translation that the press is bringing out. These books, for those of you that haven't read them, and yours is only just out, I believe, right? Pretty recently? Yeah. So probably many of you haven't read Sharmila's book yet, but Margo Jefferson's book came out in 2015. They're beautifully written. They're lyrical, full of wit, and often self-reflexive humor, but they're also passionate and subtly fiery in their critical examination of systemic prejudice, discrimination, and injustice in our country. They are memoirs, but they're much more than just memoirs. There's a lot of cultural history, a lot of deep cultural history in both books, as well as cultural criticism and literary history. And I hope we're going to get to talking a little bit about some of the literature they cite later on. So I'd like to start out by asking each author to unpack for us a little bit the title of their book. And I'll start with Margo Jefferson.
I thought you would start because of our panel title with.
Oh, well, we could do that. Sure, we could. Okay, sure, absolutely. So, Not Quite, Not White, and you have as a subtitle, Losing and Finding Race in America. I think it's on, but
yeah.
You might have to hold it closer.
Yeah, I'll hold it closer. I don't think the subtitle needs any explanation. Seriously, but the main title is it's in the book I talk about the idea of not whiteness and in all the many ways in which not whiteness works. What it means to be not white. It doesn't always mean black. It doesn't mean Asian. But it does give one the power to name whiteness. And the not quite part of it is also kind of talking about the part of this book which is about the immigrant experience. I came to the United States when I was 12 years old. So race was something that I discovered along with, all the flavors of Baskin and Robbins ice cream back in 1982. So, and the immigrant experience is often an experience of not quiteness, which is, that you're, in many ways you're often reaching towards various kinds of things and you're kind of almost there but not quite, and which is something that is actually quite pleasing and suitable often, and I'll sort of say this for the dominant culture, because it's very flattering to be mimicked and imitated, but yet it's nice and safe to know that this kind of new arrival will not quite become a part of who you are. So, and so I play with those ideas of what it means to be not quite. Obviously, not quite is also meant to be a modifier of not white. So what it means to be not quite not white. And it's horrible to have to explain one's title because after you've done it, I have to say now I thoroughly hate the title of my book.
No, but it's wonderful, and particularly in the last chapter where her last chapter is called The Heart of Non Whiteness, and you really beautifully expand on the title. In terms of Negroland, when I first
Deflate Mr. Conrad.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, when I first saw the title of your book, of course, I thought of Lewis Carroll and even Walt Disney. Echoes, But if you could tell us a little bit about what and where is or was Negroland.
Negroland, yeah. Well, I wanted Negroland to be both okay, to be both historical and, in a sense, mythological. Yes, definitely. Negro, speaking of not white, actually translates in Spanish and Portuguese. It means black, but the history of a minority group, certainly an oppressed people, can be tracked in many ways. But one of the ways is the sequence and the clutter and the clashing of names that they are given, that are bestowed on them to place them, to confine them, to literally confine them and to mythologize them. And the names that they often, pushing back, bestow on themselves. So, the history in terms of names of Black people, I say that because I came of age in the late 60s with Black Power. And so a transition from Negro, the proper Negro, to Black was very exciting for me. Today, more people say African American. But the names that we gave ourselves as political, cultural, people self-defining, began in the late 19th, turn of the 20th century. They colored people, which sounds terribly antique, but it sounds much better when you join it to a kind of analysis of the third world and come up with people of color. But that's separate. Colored people then gave way, teens, 20s, with the rise of the new Negro and a kind of post-World War I militants to Negro capitalized. Negro, small n, was still an insult. The battle to get it capitalized by newspapers and such went on until around, I believe the Times caved in 1936. So this book is very much about a particular period, the first 50, 60 to 60, 65 years of the 20th century. And that really was the heyday for self-conscious, defining themselves as progressing, moving, challenging. That was the heyday of Negro. So I wanted the word to have that historical resonance, to have that slight uncomfortable shock. I have had friends who said, I felt a little embarrassed with the title on the subway. I didn't want people to challenge me, and I got that. Then I combined it with land because, land is so resonant. There's your homeland. Well, the United States became an enforced homeland, but there are also the links to Africa and to all other countries of one's origin. There is the sense in which a land is fraught and bordered by enemies, and certainly you could even call all Black neighborhoods in cities and towns, or whole all Black regions surrounded by hostile or not uninterested, suspicious white neighbors. Those are lands of a sort. And finally, it spoke to, two things. It spoke to a kind of longing for wholeness and community. And I wanted it also to convey that sense of privacy and at moments almost enchanted safety that I did feel at times in this world which was self-designated as a particular world of privilege and Negro accomplishment. That also gave me room for what would become a critique of it.
At the very end here, you brought in the class dimension. It has that.
Very much so, yes.
It's the middle class.
Yeah, which likes to think of itself as an upper class. So that kind of slippage mirrors the slippage of Negro, colored African American. Yeah.
Both books contain, they're very serious in many ways in their subject matter, but they sparkle with a great deal of humor. And Dr. Sen.
Tried for
yeah. Dr. Sen, I'd like to go back to you, and you talk, and you mentioned this just briefly, but you talked about getting a race when you arrived in 1982 as a 12-year-old, and I loved this sentence. I got raced the way people get chicken pox. Would you want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I think that section, which is from the preface of the book, I say that I got raced the way people got chicken pox. I got raced the way you get a cell phone or a pair of shoes. So, which is meant to be, of course, like a disease, something to communicate with, something to try on for size. I got raced in the way that I learned to speak American. So in the American vernacular, when you finally get something, exactly. I got race, So that's what, the many ways the INS gave me that. But what I really, of course, am getting at is that I spent the first 12 years of my life in a country where we did not have this kind of particular American grammar of race and an understanding of race. We had, like all societies, we had many, many ways of course, dividing ourselves up, creating hierarchies, policing those hierarchies, and of course, people trying to cross them, right? So in the society in which I grew up, the ways in which we kind of divided people or kind of cataloged people was along lines of religion or linguistic group, of course, social class, economic class, caste. And, I also say veg, non-veg. Yeah. Said in India, veg and non-veg is as evocative as black and white is in America.
You can get killed.
Whether you're veg and non-veg tells you a lot. But there's a reason
in extreme cases.
Why I think both socially and culturally I grew up with all these different ways in which we categorized ourselves and we policed those categories. But there was also a legal reason, which I didn't know, of course, as a child, but I only learned as an adult, is because the India I grew up in, did not have race as a category in its census. So the first census in India comes out in 1951. That's the first census taken in independent India. And there is a conscious decision by the state and by the people who organized that census to not use race as a category. So it had actually, it's sort of, also institutionalized, right? So by the time I'm talking about 1970s India, a good, 30 years has passed where the state itself had not been using this category, this race category. And I come to the US, and of course there isn't a form where those boxes weren't there, right? And I had to figure out which box do I tick. And then there was and that's where I started learning about, of course, it's easy to say I got race, but I didn't get race. Because, see, in 1982, the United States Census had decided that people from the subcontinent, South Asians, as they're called now, which is not a term that was that much in vogue in the 80s and is a relatively new coinage. It's a CIA term, actually. It's a term of strategy. It's not a term that people in the subcontinent gave themselves. It's an exogenous term that has since then been adopted. Were to self-report. And there's a long history of this, and I write about this in my book, about sort of beginning in the late 19th and early 20th century, of sort of where people from my part of the world, which is the Indian subcontinent, which is second only to the continent of Africa in its genetic diversity. right? So where do we fall in this kind of American grammar and topology, of race? And there have been these really incredibly important Supreme Court cases where Indian men had been going and trying to prove themselves to be white. Bhagat Singh Thind is a very famous case. And why were these Indian men trying to find a race or assign a race? Because they were trying to become naturalized citizens. Because that's another part of the history of this country, is that from 1790 until 1950, naturalization was reserved largely for whites. So non-whites could immigrate, but they could not become naturalized citizens, right? So, not all of them could immigrate. There was also, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the great sort of Asian barred zone of which India was a part. But we kind of, where we are, the courts are crazy. Different courts, some say, this man from Punjab is white, and another court would say not. I read all the old cases and the ways in which they're determining it, looking at skin, the veins.
That's the same,
right? Fingernails.
Yes.
Can you see the blue vein?
Yes.
So this is a very American story, right?
That's so adaptable.
Yes.
Any non-European group arrives and they adapt.
They're trying to find out. And then by the 70s, they decide, there's a point where for a while they become white. So they could be Caucasian. And actually, I should say Caucasian, because there were many white. Because in some of the courts said these Indian men were Caucasian, but Caucasian is not the same as white. It's not white enough. So you can be Caucasian, but it's not white. And it's whiteness that will allow you to become a naturalized citizen. That's what the courts said. But by 1980, it was Indian immigrant groups that wanted to be reclassified as Asian, to avail themselves to greater affirmative action. So now, what does the census do? Because what about those white Indians, right? So then it's sort of, by the time I arrived, I feel like, they've just kind of given up. They've thrown up their hands and said, self-report. And this really fascinating census data on the self-reporting and how people from the subcontinent currently self-report on the census, right? Because, from a tiny minority that self-reports as white, there's even smaller as black, and most actually are self-reporting using terms that apply to the subcontinent. So they're kind of like filling in the form. They're not using the kind of available categories in the current census. I don't know what the 2020 census will give us. They're trying to revise it, which is yes, which is very much in conversation with what's going on with Hispanics, for instance, right?
Yes.
And the new census that's going to come out. Yeah.
It's even a conversation that goes on, sometimes sotto voce, among blacks when it comes to how you categorize yourself if you are biracial.
Right.
Can you make her laugh?
Obama, actually, I always found it fascinating. It was not surprising that he self-identified as black, that he could talk about his white mother and grandparents was interesting, but he was not able, and I'm sure that was choice as well, but it was politically expedient, he was not able to be identified as the first biracial president, because that is still so charged on all fronts, black and white. One could call him, as you could call Meghan Markle, black and biracial, but that's my attempt to try to revise the categories. But that goes on in every family with mixed race children, and now, with thanks to Skip Gates, all the gene testing, many people who always assumed I'm black, but always like to claim some Native American blood, are discovering that technically, in some ways, the explosion of the monolith of race, they are mixed race also. So, you then redefine what being black or African American means. You have to.
There's that wonderful chapter where you ask your mother, "Are we Indian?"
Oh, we have Indian blood?
Do we have Indian blood?
Yes.
That's
right.
And she says, "I'm so tired of
I'm so tired of black people who always say they do and of white people who always ask if we do." Yes.
So this brings me to a question for you about your, so in Professor Jefferson's book, you'll meet many extraordinary characters if you haven't read it yet. Amazing people like Joseph Wilson of Philadelphia, who was a 19th century member of the black elite, your Uncle Lucius, who passed as white for most of his life,
until
but
he retired from his job,
he retired,
where he needed to be white.
You put it, he retired to Negroland.
Exactly.
Which was
Exactly.
really interesting. But I think the two people, besides you and your sister Denise, to whom the book is dedicated, I saw, the people who jumped out at me the most were your parents, your mother and father, and especially your mother,
yes.
Irma Jefferson. A woman of extraordinary grace, courage, but also candor. I mean, the frankness with which she talked to you and your sister as you were growing up. Would you want to say a little more about your mother?
Mother was a kind of, my mother was, I also do want to say this business of, I was so struck by the range of tones in You Discovered Race, and that range of tones is so important to minority, immigrant, whatever experience, because one of the things that tends to be imposed on us is, a certain tone of interpreting our experience, which is usually grief-stricken in some way, and involves identifying oneself as victimized. I mean, God knows one is in ways, but kind of taking that on. So every time I find a range of tones, which is a right and a privilege, I'm very happy to see it. This is what my parents very much wanted to give my sister and me, along with, and this is always the struggle, a constant awareness and consciousness of the risks to us as Negroes, as black people, the history with its risks and its achievements and its going forwards and backs, etc. So my mother was kind of a genius of a range of tones in this way, but also very interested in, she was, in many ways, and in certain ways she really was a snob, but she was also very analytical of social and racial categories. So I think one of the stories you're thinking of, and she was very much the mother as pedagogue, as the person who very much shapes the character and the experience of her children. There was power in her role. And subtlety as well. In any case, in grammar school, I went to her one day. I went to an almost all white, small collection of Negroes, elementary and high school attached to the University of Chicago. So it was as progressive as you were going to be in the 50s, but, of course, it was full of its own, it was a privileged private school, so it was socially, intellectually, racially privileged. So I went home to my mother one day and I said, "Oh, Mother, are we rich?" And my mother looked at me, and I explained that several of my school friends, all white, had said, usually when she arrived to pick me up in her car came into school, you must be rich. So I said, "Are we?" And I told her why, and she said, no. She said she decided not to quite take up all the race things at that moment, but she said, first of all, you're not supposed to ask that question. It's rude. So, first came social status and manners. She said, if anyone asks, you can say, we're comfortable. Okay. She said, but they shouldn't have asked, and don't you ever think you can ask someone that. Then I said, well, I was, filled with my schoolmates and feeling kind of, I don't know, I wanted to be boastful, I think. And I said, well, are we upper class? And Mother looked at me, and I could see there she was going to settle in for a little bit of a lesson. And she said, we are considered upper class Negroes and upper middle class Americans, by which I already knew she meant among white Americans. She said, and most people, meaning white Americans, would like to consider us just more Negroes. And I thought, oh. And, I never forgot it. And it was in condensed form for a young adult, very exact.
Yes.
Social and political and cultural.
Exact is the word I would use. She seemed to really, at a number of points in the story, she just nails it with a sentence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which for a daughter can sometimes be quite exhausting. The person who appears to be ubiquitously wise.
Dr. Sen, there's one little vignette in your book that especially made me cringe. This is at a point in your life where you're trying very, very hard to be American, as defined by a kind of dominant white cultural American. You're hoping that your schoolmates don't smell cumin and coriander on your clothes. You're working hard to perfect a range of no-bake Jell-O desserts, which you're serving to the family. And in the middle of this, a co-worker of your mother's, who you describe as a tall, lanky white man with wispy brown hair, who eats organic vegetarian food and admires Indian culture, comes home with your mother one day to learn how to make paneer. And I could see myself in this character. I've definitely done such things. But I'd like you to, because this sets you on a reflection about being exoticized and about those who have the luxury to sample other cultures, and I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. When I was writing that section, I certainly didn't think that you would ask me to talk about it, but I think it's only fitting that you do. I didn't just sort of immigrate from one country into another. I immigrated from one language into another because English is not my mother tongue. It's the language I learned to speak as my third language. My mother tongue is Bengali. I learned Hindi as my second language in India, and then I learned English as my third language, also in India. But I didn't learn American. So, I learned American, of course, in the United States. The most, I think, American thing I didn't realize then when I was a young child about me was my constant quest for self-improvement. Americans are probably the most self-improving people in the world, and I think I had that. So I was going to work out okay as an immigrant, I think. But I was not only, so I was immigrating into a language. I was also, learning to train my palate, not just, picking up the right accent, which I did, I confess, largely by watching television after school. Mm-hmm. But the palate, getting used to new foods, and everyone who has to have moved to a different country and lived there, this is something that comes up. You have to get used to new tastes and new textures and new cuisines, and not just get used to it, then you have to learn what's the cool kind. What are the class connotations? And I was very aware of this as a young girl, that, what the class connotations of this would be, and what my parents could afford, and what our more well-off friends were, encouraging us to do, for instance, So I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my parents, would go to supermarkets, and our sort of more well-off, cooler friends would say, you should go to Lexington and go to the farmer's market in Lexington, and you should really have, Nordic rye and goose liver pate, and I was exposed to all of that. And then at home, usually we had the sort of, the cheaper things you can buy in an American supermarket, which is largely a lot of processed foods. Like, I think, what my mother thought was cooking American, which was really a code word in our home for cooking white, was dousing things with Campbell's soup or Kraft cheese or all the things that Bisquick packets in the back used to sort of say, you know, and the only kind of from scratch thing she had learned to make in our first year here was this date nut bread that her coworker, this black woman, Enid, had given her a recipe. And I think I still have it, a little index card of the date nut bread that we baked in a Folgers coffee can. And then it slid out, and it was this perfect cylinder with this ridges. And Enid had said, you have to have it with Philly cream cheese. And it was it was like one of the things about America I remember. And as the years went by, I've sort of learned to be grateful for what that woman did, who wrote down a recipe on a piece of paper. Because I think that's how we share things with each other, you know, because recipes are cultural memories. And you can kind of go make it. Now, I, of course, was also learning to make new things, and I was afraid of baking, like turning on the oven. That's why the Jell-O no-bake thing, you know. So I just realized if I learned how to use the mixer, which is Cool Whip and Jell-O, could lead to, like, incredibly beautiful creations.
Layers.
So layers. I mean,
Okay.
yes. Yes, I did many, many beautiful creations. This is what I did. Now, meanwhile, we did also sometimes cook. My mother made some foods that we were used to, but you know, we didn't have a car in our first year, and the grocery stores that had Indian spices were not in Cambridge, so we couldn't get there. So my mother went to the Star Market, which is a local supermarket chain, and got those Durkee jars, and you know, she probably had 2 spices out of which she would try and create some things that would remind us of the foods that we used to eat when we lived in India. We didn't think that was special. This is why when the tall white man with lanky brown hair, who's not Philip Lutgendorf, came to my house when I was 13 once, you know, in the afternoon, and during lunch break, he was one of my mother's colleagues, and he wanted to learn how to make paneer, which to us is like somebody following you home to say, show me how to make toast or how to boil pasta, you know? And now it's not very hard to make paneer, by the way, without having any access to Indian grocery stores. You just need whole milk and some lime and a little piece of muslin cloth. So my mother went through the process of made it for him, and I remember sitting in the kitchen in a corner and watching her. And I'd never seen anybody, I mean, no one in India goes and watches somebody make paneer. It's just an odd thing, you know, and so just the way he sat, and you know, and he was like an anthropologist. That's, of course, you know, that's where that goes.
Exactly.
And we were the subjects that he was studying, you know, and then she squeezed it, and then she didn't cut it, and you know.
Was he making notes?
I think he might have, you know, and
It's very possible.
very possible, you know. And then he left, and my mother and I looked at each other, and we just burst out laughing. Oh, how wonderful. We said, oh. So he became, and he's sort of, you know, we still remember him, you know, I mean, but where it goes, and this is where I'll leave you, is where I end with that. I said, you know, but my mother and I, even back then, and she was, you know, she was a woman in her mid-30s then, I was around 13 years old. We had been in this country for 1 year, but she knew that this is a trap. This thing, this theater that she just enacted, it's, you know, the script is written by someone else. The audience is white. We are performing something. And there is a trap, because if she keeps cooking like this, someday someone will come and accuse us of failing to assimilate, right? To stick to your ways. You know, it's a kind of trap. If you keep cooking with Bisquick, then we're just sort of wannabes, right? The not-quites, right? And that look on his face, and it was also a trap, because the way in which, you know, he had learned this, we said, oh, you know, now he's going to go and tell his friends. He's learned the authentic way, and we were the you know, but he was our proxy. And this we hated too, so we discussed this. The idea of what happens when the anthropologist goes and describes, we did not want to be the subjects of his study. We wanted to be the people who speak for ourselves, right? Yes. So this is why the paneer man became such a legend for us. And you know, and I mean, I have seen that, the look on his face. I studied, you know, I was just a silent observer standing in a corner of that kitchen. And he was like, oh, and I thought, oh, is this how Lawrence of Arabia felt? Is this how Richard Burton felt when he like broke bread with Muslims in Mecca, like when he was like pretending to be a Muslim?
In brown face.
Yes. Is this, I mean, there's that whole idea of we were being discovered by him and we were doing this very authentic native thing. Yeah. And I think, and as I said, but it's a trap. There are traps in all directions.
Absolutely.
In this. There's no quite correct way of being or eating.
And then he appropriates it and performs it for
Yes.
others.
Yeah.
Very
Yes.
much the way arts and crafts and
Yes.
this are appropriated.
I
from
learned
the
this from a
so-called native
Bengali woman.
people. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Sujata, how are we doing on time? 10 minutes till questions. Well, there's a question I want to ask both of you, because this is a literature festival. We're all celebrating literature, and you both are obviously avid readers. And if you read the books, you'll see they're full of literary references and allusions to everything from Shakespeare and the Indian classics, to slave narratives, captive narratives, Conrad, Joyce, many contemporary writers, poets, as well as popular culture, music, and so on. And I know you've been the theater critic for the New York Times, but I was struck by the fact that both of you seem to have had a particular relationship with the novel Little Women and Louisa May Alcott. And both of you include what I would call sort of extended meditations on the novel and its characters. Very insightful, very witty. But clearly the characters in that novel served both of you in thinking about your own identities. And I'd like to invite you to comment on that, maybe starting with Margo Jefferson.
Well, it's in Negroland. This is my childhood and my sister's, our childhood engagement with, one of the classics of girls' literature, is filtered through an experience of a serious male writer. And my first extended encounter with a serious black male writer, it's filtered through James Baldwin's merciless critique of Little Women. And so when I first read James Baldwin in high school, his essays were assigned, and he was being published in paperback, and he'd made a great stir at that point. But there was one essay in particular where he was denouncing certain kinds of sentimentality, and not surprisingly, he kept it largely to a female tradition. It began with Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it climaxed for him with Little Women. Now, the problem for me with this was I was thrilled by the presence of James Baldwin. He represented high intellect, mighty and subtle, also prose. He was an extraordinary figure of a black creative artist who was also a social and cultural force. So all my ambitions were being stirred in some way, in a way that Joe's writing was not going to stir them. We won't pretend that. But when I got to this moment in the essay where, he says, it has all the contemptible sentimentality of Little Women, I was mortified. I felt caught out. I felt that I wasn't good enough for this high and mighty black male tradition. I suddenly realized, oh, wait a minute. I may not have full access to this either. Now, did I put it in quite those words? No. But did I feel it that way? Absolutely. And that really is why I returned to the book and reworked it, revised it, partly through my sisters and my experiences at certain points, but partly through also in a rather traditional literary way, reading more layers into it while acknowledging fully the consolations of sentimentality that Alcott had very little choice about in terms of the culture and in terms of her own psyche. So it's looking at something old and meaningful through a self that you didn't first see it with, and still finding something, but something different, something renewing. I even had to critique my choice of characters, of women of girls to identify with. So,
Who would you identify with?
Well, if we have to, which we didn't want to, but this showed me a great deal about the shaping of a child, sometimes a second child, certainly a girl child. My sister had claimed Joe, and she was the older sister, and she was bossy. And I knew, and I adored her, I knew I could not contend. There was no room in our relationship for both of us to be Joe. So I chose to be the pious and very, very good, beloved child. I chose Beth. And I told myself, well, I'm a very good pianist. That's why I'm doing it. That's my talent. She makes it, as I say, Alcott makes it virtually impossible to choose, for example, Amy, who is full of ambition and greed and a kind of, avidity for life. She's a little bitch, so you can't choose her. Meg has no, please.
I know.
But we were saying,
we have some
you have
choices
come up
now.
with much more brilliant choices, and I turned it over to you.
Well, I should say, having no siblings, I'm fascinated with the idea that, if you have a sister who's already claimed one, then this seems to me the closest I can relate to this is sort of, when I was a teenager and with our girlfriends, we could each choose only one Duran to like.
Yes!
Of Duran. So like if your best girlfriend has chosen, Simon Le Bon or John Taylor, you're kind of stuck with Andy Taylor.
In my wife's generation, it was which Beatle did you want to marry?
And you
right.
make the best of
You
one
make the
yourself.
best of what you have, and it's the unspoken code of girlhood. But as we were saying right before the session began, I said, now, so I was being a little wicked and asking her, because we had just sort of issued a little bit of a threat to Philip Lutgendorf and said, please don't ask us which March sister we want to be.
We don't want to be
It's such a
asked that.
cliche.
Right.
Women are always asked this, but if you are to ask this
I didn't
now, and you didn't. No, I'm saying I'm being wicked. So
We were being wicked
you knew
together,
what you were
but you
being
took
set
the
up
lead.
for. So I said, I would say, I want to be Laurie's grandfather. I want to be the old man with the money that everyone else is sucking up to.
I love
And all these other young women are entertaining me. That's what I
That
want
was
to
the
be.
breakthrough.
Yes,
That's the
yes.
poster-
And
yeah.
and second choice is that aunt.
Aunt March,
Yeah.
mean, power-wielding Aunt March.
Yes. So I
That's
think it's yes. Amy might have been a little bitch, but I guess I would have
of
liked
the
to have been her.
sisters,
But now I'm pretty comfortable in middle age to say I just want to be one of those characters that had power and money, and everybody else was dancing around basically.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. I love it. It's a whole new outlook.
Are we going to go to Q&A now, or do we?
We still have a couple, we've got about 17, 18 minutes to go.
Okay, so let me ask you both, just as before we go to Q&A, in terms of the present moment and the future. You write a lot about your kids and how they're finding their way in a different way. But I guess I'm inviting both of you to say something about maybe how things have changed in your lifetime, but also not. And are we back where we always were in this ugly, race-riven society? Or, I mean, I don't know, is it too vast a question to entertain in the closing section here?
It's probably too vast unless we get at it through real particular.
I think
Do
so.
you
I
mind
mean,
the
I could give you a
particulars?
family particular. So you spoke, but
Yes,
yeah.
that's
So I
good.
have 3 teenage children. I have a daughter and 2 sons, and of course their America is different from the one I came to, and by the way, the whole I get race thing, I should say, I decided to flip it. As you know, I said I was the homeland, race was the immigrant. I chose to keep it and naturalize it, finally.
Yes, yes.
But like to be serious for a second, I was born as the citizen of an independent country. My parents and my grandparents were born colonial subjects. So I have to, so there are lots of things to be pessimistic about, but if I even just look at one family, and I know that, in the space of 2 generations, we went from being subjects to citizens, that's an enormous thing. So for somebody from India, that's not something, I take for granted. So all of this, when I talk about naturalization, when I talk about citizenship, I also write about it with that awareness that in my, and my grandfather, who was, spent between the ages of 18 and 21, was in a British jail because he was a freedom fighter, that, we know that even the right to be a citizen was fought quite recently. And in our families that, these
Yes,
are
that's true.
very real memories, right? So it's and not something to take so for granted. I'm not, even when I'm being funny about some of these things, it's no joke because, we know how recent that history was. And the other thing I mentioned about that, the naturalization laws, somebody asked me last night at the Dushanbe Tea House about the U.S. moment. Is this a particularly unfriendly moment for immigrants and so on and so forth? I said, yes, in some ways you could, but I'm not being sort of yay Pollyanna about it. I'm just looking at sort of the history of this country in more than 10-year chunks, right? And I said, just remember, 100 years ago, I might not have been able to even immigrate because I was in a part of the world that was part of the barred zone. Let's remember that. Let's remember that until the 40s, people from the Indian subcontinent fell still within that group of people who were not allowed naturalization, right? So you could immigrate, but even to be allowed naturalization, that these are very recent gains, that of course, what I also know, as probably any of you who are naturalized citizens know, what can be given can be taken away.
Can be taken, yes.
And that's nothing new, by the way. That's been part of that's part of immigration law. What can be given can be taken away in every country that allows naturalization. Not only can it be taken away from you, but it can be taken away from those who gained their citizenship through you.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a precarity that is so ubiquitous to your life. You live with it. It becomes your oxygen. It's not something I think about every day, but I'm probably a little bit more aware of it than those who don't have to think of it. And I'm very aware of it because I had to renounce my Indian citizenship in order to get this, because the country of my birth doesn't allow dual citizenship. So it was a real choice, and I respect that, but it was a choice. So I had to actually give up something. Any country whose citizenship you've given up, it's very difficult ever to go back and reclaim citizenship, right? So
That's
if
right.
I know this because I have friends who have American citizenship and then gave it up. And if you try to become a U.S. citizen again, believe me, the obstacles are very, because you're a suspicious category, right? So those are kind of precarities, but I think that's always been around. So I kind of want to say there are certain strides. We went from subjects to citizens. We gained the right to become naturalized. But as I said, what can be given can be taken away.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the word precarity.
Yes,
That's
I was
exactly
thinking that
right.
resonates in your book a lot.
Yeah, no, and because of course any citizens, any group of people in a country, the majority of whose members did not want them there and do not want them there except under conditions of inferiority and servitude, their status will always be precarious. It's the laws, and this I see similarities to what you're saying. Certain, there's a progression through from the Civil War, through the Civil Rights Movement, through Black Power, through now, the Black Lives Matter. There's always the struggle. There's always progress. These laws were starting to be challenged in the early 50s, just as India was refusing to use race on that census category. The United States was gearing up the civil rights movement for major challenges to these laws that segregated, deprived. But what keeps happening? All right, vote. We get the vote. Now there are a series of clever and vicious devices by which voter fraud is in. Yes, exactly. Voter suppression. Exactly. The policemen who used to beat you up on civil rights marches and Black Power marches are now simply, and they have always been there, in neighborhoods every day, every week, attacking, beating citizens. And there were right to, what's the right to arm? Stand your ground. So there are always those shifting laws. It is true that there have been, of course, things have happened, things are possible that were impossible. My book really starts with my parents as adults, in the 40s. There's an historical period, there's a kind of historical account that precedes that, when Black people and a small group of liberal and progressive and radical others, whites, but also Asians, Filipinos, are really putting on a push to change the face of racial law and discrimination. The need to regress, to go back, to relive the thrill of bigotry is and unearned privilege is staggering to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if I can add one thing to what Margo Jefferson just said, and it's perhaps, sort of with a little bit of a bite, and I'll just say, but whenever the last 2 years or so, we've been talking about sort of the current moment, I'll be very blunt and say, I have very little in common, though, with anyone who discovered that America is a racist country after November 2016.
Yeah.
Not much of a conversation.
No, that's not a conversation. Yes.
Exactly.
Well, with that, let's. I know there's going to be lots
We've only got 10 minutes for questions, so let's keep them quick.
No, I didn't mean to.
No.
I'm interested in the contrast between race and national cultural identity. So let me give two examples. One would be Obama, who I think I see as a man who emigrated, in a sense, to Black America as an adult, I think probably when he moved to Chicago. And before that, his experience wasn't that of a Black American with origins in the South and slavery and so forth.
Well, but I have to add, there were plenty of Black Americans whose origins were not necessarily in the South or in slavery. I know what you're saying,
Yes.
and nevertheless,
but what I'm saying
it was
is
a specialized experience, but it was, and a less well-known race experience, but it was a recognizable.
But what I'm saying is there is, in fact, a Black nation distinct from white America with its own traditions and
Yes.
very rich culture and so
Yes,
forth.
yes.
And he was not a native of that culture. As opposed to, I'll give another example, there was a guy named Johnny Otis. I don't know if you ever heard of him.
Absolutely.
So he had a very important R&B review in the early 50s, in fact, late 40s. And Johnny Otis was a white man of Greek descent who grew up in I don't know what city he grew up in, but Black urban America. His father owned a little grocery shop. And he stayed in Black urban America his whole life. And so he became kind of an icon of the Black community. He was essentially a Black man in the national cultural sense.
I would
That
say
was his
he was
culture.
part of Black culture. I see what you mean about he was essentially a black man, but I would not say essentially. I would say he lived and performed among black people and assumed many of the cultural styles, traditions of black people, men, and was comfortable there and wanted to be there. So maybe he was an immigrant or an immigrant to that.
I mean,
And
Not
Greek-
quite.
I mean, yeah.
and Greeks themselves have a particular kind of, if I might say, a not quite-ness
That's
about
right,
them,
that's
too.
right.
That's sort of the edges of European whiteness.
That's exact- yes,
is
that's
sort
very
of,
right.
guarded by
Yes.
the Greeks, who gave ancient culture, but now are not, quite. I mean,
Not
are they
quite.
in the EU? Are they not?
Yes, good
right.
point.
I mean, think about
That's right,
Right.
that's right.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure what you're asking. I mean, I think what you're illustrating is the variety and cultural subtlety of what we think of as very fixed cultural definitions.
I guess I'm interested in a way, elevating the nationhood of Black America, in a way, because in my experience, I think of it as, I've lived in two foreign cultures. I lived in France, and I lived for a while in Black America. And the experience was similar in some ways, even though there isn't there's a history of oppression of Black America, but there's also the fact that it's really like a separate
It
nation.
has vast and extensive and varied and rich cultural and social and political traditions, yes. Yeah,
I guess
absolutely.
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I do want to allow for some other questions.
Yeah, I was really, first of all, thank y'all for this conversation. This was really good. This was like really touching in so many ways. But I was listening to y'all and I was thinking about the culture of bread and how bread exists in every culture to a degree. And I was drawn to the fact that there was sort of this great disdain with the paneer story, but this great celebration with the date canned bread story. And as melanin gifted people, I'm curious of how you can cross-culturally share and be in positive light on one side, even maybe without knowing the cultural experience of the other side, but then know for certain that the wispy brown-haired man in the kitchen might not do well with the recipe. Does that make sense?
Okay, it's sort of, but I think that's a little bit. I mean, we have to be very careful about. I hear what you're saying, and I mean, you have to keep in mind that the date not bread recipe was just offered up as a gift, not something we asked for. That was just given as a gift.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It was a gift given by my mother's colleague, by not a request. My mother didn't say, "Hey, Enid, in the middle of your busy workday, can we walk to your home, and can you take an hour to chop dates and walnuts and mix the brown sugar and go through all of that?" That it was just a present that she wrote it down and gave it. The other part of the story, right, and also you have to remember that, that there was not sort of a kind of an exoticization. There is no way in which, at least in the America in which we lived then, that my mother wouldn't be able to kind of gain cultural capital by talking to her friends about this kind of, because we were we didn't know how to do anything that was authentically American. A lot of in that section, I also talk about authenticity. Right, what I'm actually pushing and pulling with is the idea of authenticity. So I should tell you this, even, what we called the paneer man. In the book, I say, I'm Bengali, we don't call that paneer. Paneer is just, we call it chana, right? He called it paneer because he had had it in an Indian restaurant, and just not to kind of go into like, for all this kind of, we were just like, all right, you want to call it paneer? Sure, But I thought about it, and I thought, my mother woke up early, did a whole bunch of housework, went to work, and then She walked from her office during her 1-hour lunch break. This man followed her. He sat there in our kitchen, and she did all the labor. He watched her, took notes, and then took away the disc. Then she walked back to work. Then she came home 3 hours later, cooked the dinner, washed the dishes, did all these kinds of things. So there is a kind of, there was something happening in that room that even with my clumsy, childish shrewdness, I could see that it wasn't the same as Enid just passing on a piece of, like an index card in which she had scribbled a recipe.
Enjoy this.
Yes, which is not to say we learn from each other all the time. By the way, I'm not a person who at all is a kind of, I'm the last to guard for authentic anything. In fact, I'm suspicious of what I'm questioning is this whole idea, and as Philip very correctly said, is that idea that we were somehow being in a position of performing a certain kind of authenticity for somebody else's intellectual and physical consumption.
Are we at that time?
I am really sorry. I know we have a lot of questions, but we're completely out of time, and we do need to move things along. So thank you so much to the panelists, to Sharmila, Margo, and Philip. This was a wonderful, wonderful session.